I'll be talking about an analysis report that we wrote last year for Zcash about how shielded transactions used in a merchant setting are actually how they comply to the GDPR and how they relate to the GDPR. And we've also looked at some of the privacy aspects of it. Now, this report we worked on this in October last year. And I'm not the only author. My co-author of the report is Mr. Craig McMullen, who also works for Koala IP. And we have a bunch of reviewers from the Lease Authority team there as well. And I put the QR code here, so if you're interested in having a look at the report, then by all means, it's freely available on our website. So this leads you directly to the PDF. All right. So the thing that we've been looking at, the reports that we've been looking at, was in the situation of October 2018. So it is a little bit, it's a bit longer ago that this was actually written and produced, and we also looked predominantly at the situation back in October. We had a look at the usage of Zcash shielded transactions to pay for private storage using the S4 protocol. And S4, and I'll go a little bit deeper into that, is a protocol that is developed by Lease Authority for secure storage of files. It's based on specifications for what is called P4, and some of you may have been in the workshop that was there yesterday with Liz Steiniger, who actually spoke about the P4 protocol for periodic private payments. And we are also working on the assumption that there may be personal data stored on this storage service that's being paid for. So we're not only looking at the payment side, but also at the storage side of things, where we look at is there actually personal data involved. And we are assuming that that particular thing may make the operator a processor under the GDPR, and I'll get a little bit deeper into that as well. We also had a look at the general privacy aspects. And of course, we had a look at the compliance to the General Data Protection Regulation, which is in effect in Europe since May last year. So very quickly about the S4 protocol, the storage service that we actually did the analysis on with the hypothetical situation of adding payments, private payments on top of that. And it's a four-step process. The customer uses a client that has synchronized folders throughout the service, and files that are uploaded are encrypted and sharded amongst different servers that are then operated again by a Lease Authority in this particular situation. And if you look at the flow of this, the first step would be to access a .onion website, receive an invite code through something like Magic Wormhole, which is something that is actually here, ensuring that there is access to these files. And then the client would need to be launched, enter this invite code, this Magic Wormhole code, and receive an invoice through the specific client. And the invoice is a long string of text with all the details in there, and that's being submitted through this particular client. The client pays for the invoice. The client will also warn when a subscription will run out, and it will also help renewing the subscription and ending the subscription. So from a very high level, the GDPR is the General Data Protection Regulation. It's an EU-wide privacy regulation which applies to any natural person in the EU, so not residents, not citizens, but anyone on EU soil, so to say. There's a very broad definition of personal data, basically anything that can lead back to a natural person can be considered personal data in most circumstances. It embraces principles such as transparency, data minimization, control, and accountability, all great aspects and great principles. They're also very much in line with the decentralized thought good. It gives very broad rights to data subjects, such as the right to deletion, what probably most of you have heard about, and there are very steep fines for non-compliance to the GDPR. And the main goal of the GDPR is to give the same level of protection to allow for easy data transfer within the EU. Also, there are additional requirements for transferring data outside of the EU, especially if you would want to transfer data to the US. There are specific requirements that you would need to take into account, that you would need to deal with in order to do that, in order to make this flow of data, transfer data possible. Right, another interesting aspect is the two main roles under the GDPR of a controller and a processor, where the controller actually determines the means and the purpose of processing and has the primary responsibility for the data, for the personal data that this entity collects. There's also the processor, which only processes data on a clearly written instruction of a controller and still has quite some responsibility for that particular data under the GDPR. Now, if I add some examples to that, right? Looking at the controller, if Alice would be a customer of a certain service, then the controller, Alice would be the data subject and the service would be the controller and would store that Alice is actually a customer. Now, another situation that is a little bit more interesting is where Alice actually uses the service at the processor to store information about others, for example, for a mailing list or perhaps any kind of database that they're storing. And in this case, Alice is not the data subject anymore because she stores data of someone else on the service, but becomes a controller and the service becomes a processor. And especially in distributed environments, and this is where I'm doing quite a bit of work on recently, this is one of the big questions. So who is actually the controller in a distributed environment? Very easy to answer in a centralized environment, very difficult to answer in a distributed environment. As lawyers like to say, it always depends. And then there's the US problem, as I call it. The transfer of personal data between Europe and the US is something that can be legitimized, but the GDPR requires that appropriate measures have to be in place for that. There is another problem as well. The GDPR requires the protection of personal data, and the US actually demands access to data under different regulation. So this is obviously something that that's a bit of a geometry, and for this reason would normally advise against storing data in the US because it is, for this particular reason, very difficult to comply to the GDPR. Then there's the EU-US Privacy Shield in place, which may be used. You may have heard about it. It's not a great mechanism. It's based on self-certification, and it's being disputed in several legal cases at this very moment. Right, so let's have a look at the issues that we reviewed for this specific report that we worked on. There are 16 issues, and I'll run you through fairly quickly. So the first issue that we look at, and I'll show the QR code to the report afterwards so you can download it and have a look at it yourself as well. The IP addresses should generally be considered personal data under the GDPR. It is something that, with help of information from the ISP, can be led back to a natural person. And also logging the IP addresses may be needed to keep service protected, secure, and safe. And also, if Tor is enforced, the IP address does not have to be considered personal data, but from the perspective of a controller, someone keeping logs, it's of course very difficult to know, is this actually a Tor exit node that I'm logging, or is this a general IP address? File deletion is another issue that we looked at. Sharding, just like encryption, is considered a technical measure under the GDPR. This is a great way to protect data, but it doesn't mean that data would be out of scope of the GDPR. It is still personal data, it's just protected personal data. So whatever technical measures you put in place, it is very unlikely that it will ever become out of scope of the GDPR by the guidance that we know right now. And also forgetting where the shards are or forgetting the key to encrypt the data is not a mechanism to delete files in the GDPR, so definitely something that we need to think about a little bit more. Garbage collection, deletion policies are to be used in order to make sure that data is truly deleted from any shared storage that we're using. Also, for the execution of the service, it was planned to run a full node to be able to to have access to the transactions. Now, at the current moment, there are no real opinions that have clear guidance on if a node is a data processor, a data controller, what the responsibilities are under the GDPR. But one of the first opinions that we have received from the CNIL, the French data protection authorities, they say, well, clearly miners are data processors, but haven't said much about full nodes. But under the same logic, we should probably expect that nodes will have some kind of responsibility under the GDPR as well, but this is not clear yet, to be honest. So further guidance that may come out may jeopardize running a node in the future. The other issue or potential point for exposure of private data is when acquiring Zcash. So typically one would use an exchange. An exchange has KYC and AML requirements. There are alternative ways possible still at this moment. And also because a full-featured Zcash wallet is needed for the shielded transactions, there may well be a correlation possible to the users of such a wallet and the use of such a service, and thus their data at the private storage. Displaying the invoice will take place through the desktop or mobile client, and that is actually crucial to prevent data leaks as well. The risk profile of the client will change with this integration because it also has exposure and it displays where the data is to be, where the payment is to be sent. The signatures on invoice need to be checked in the P4 integrations as well. Then, at the time that we worked on the report, the sapling upgrade was due, and we also had a look at that to see if there's any difference for GDPR compliance or specifically for privacy as well. So the only real difference to this project is that there were faster zero-knowledge proofs, which resulted in higher likelihood of use, which is then better for privacy. So if anything, there's a positive effect to this. We had a look at the correlation, the possible time-based correlation between users on ClearNet that may visit a website promoting the service and then being sent to a .onion site directly after the ClearNet. So one could, or basically the service provider could possibly do a time-based correlation between the ClearNet IP address and the Tor IP address, which is of course something we need to be careful of, which is a potential privacy exposure, and but under the GDPR, deliberate attempts to de-anonymize data can be a GDPR offense as well. So this is something that is secured legally, but not so much practically or technically. The .onion address is one that every user has for themselves, like everyone who signs up for the service gets their own .onion address, and is therefore also identifiable in a way through this address. And this could also enable the behavioral analysis of transferred ciphertext. So what we looked at is in particular also like how what the possibilities are to basically use one or multiple .onion addresses, but don't have this as a single identifier for the different for the different users that are out there, but have them use one or more addresses there. We had a look at the metadata during sign up, especially what is the browser fingerprint, and also during the use of the service. What kind of transfer sizes are there? Is it possible to analyze these frequencies? Is it possible to detect patterns? Even though this data is not planned to collect at the moment, some metadata may well be generated here. We had a look at the support functionality. Of course, like if you run a software as a service, you need to have a way to obtain support. Currently, Zendesk is being used, which is US-based, which feeds back into the previous problem that I explained about the US transfer. Also, Zendesk has binding corporate rules. It's using the EU-US Privacy Shield, and Of course, a DPA, a data processing agreement that basically designates Zendesk as a processor and not as a controller of this particular data is required. So mostly just some basic things to put in place if this is to be used. And also we came up with the suggestion to perhaps use a bit more of a privacy-friendly service also to provide support in this case. Probably the most interesting issue is the issue of the data processor. So if the service is used for personal data, let's say that I run a database of my customers, which I then store on this protocol. Even though everything is encrypted and sharded, there's still a responsibility for the data on the side of the service provider. So what are the solutions that we can look at? One of the things that we looked at is excluding the use for personal data in the terms and conditions. That's a good idea or not. Left that in the middle, but that would be a possibility. We could claim it is out of scope because there are technical organizational measures in place. This is not something that I'm supporting, but this is certainly something that other services are using. Similar private storage services, they say, well, everything is encrypted, we can't see it, and therefore it is not the scope of the GDPR, which is technically not correct. So we had to look at this possibility as well. The requirement to keep records, exceptions for small organizations are in place to keep for keeping records and basically knowing who the controllers are that you are a processor for. And this specific requirement under the GDPR, if this would not be under the exception for small organizations, basically the whole idea of having private storage and not knowing who the customer is something that that is not all that relevant anymore if it's required to keep these particular records. So probably the best way to go is indeed claim the exception for small organizations here and deal with this component. The other problem though is that there's no visibility of the data. What data is being stored and what kind of liabilities may come with that is certainly something that's quite difficult. And because there's no visibility of the data, it's also very difficult to claim any exceptions, saying like, hey, we only store data X or Y. In the beginning, there would be fairly small user base. It's a new service, and of course, there's not a whole lot of opportunity to hide in a larger mass. And it's also easier to single out individuals. Quite obvious, but one of the points that for that on. The other idea or the other concept of using Tor is probably the best possible way out there, but there's still some possibilities that exit nodes or Tor nodes are compromised. It's also generally understood that users of Tor may well have something to hide, so it may also be of high interest to state actors. Nevertheless, this is probably the best approach that we have so far of providing private access to this data. The recovery key that is available for the storage service is of course a great usability feature. If you lose access to your account, you still have your recovery key, and through that you can still access your files. But of course, this also opens up a minor weakness in protecting the data. The particular ease of use, privacy, anonymity, as probably everyone in this room knows, is hard. You would need an understanding of Tor. You need to have an understanding of how to obtain Zcash. And it is certainly so that if you want to be truly private, you need to be truly perfect. These mistakes, there's quite a bit of potential for little mistakes to be made left and right. That is also a risk factor in here. The last point that we looked at is like, okay, what if we don't rely on the front-end application grid sync that is used for P4S4. Also there is of course important that any other implementation adheres by very strict guidelines, make sure that everything stays private, stays secure, and also deals with the private, with the payment and the payment request in an appropriate way. So in conclusion, first thing is that The question is like, should we allow customers to use S4 for data processing under the GDPR? And that is one of the key points that we looked at. And if that's the case, or if that's not the case, how do we effectively prevent this? Compliance depends so many other services on its use. In GDPR terms, we would easily say like, well, it is not so much about if a tool or a service or a company is GDPR compliant, but is the use GDPR compliant, and that is the key thing that's here. GDPR is still young, may evolve through ruling and guidance. That's what we also addressed in our findings 1 and 3. P4 allows for anonymous usage, but requires very careful approach from both the users and the service provider not to accidentally leak any data. And anonymous data is out of scope of the GDPR, and through that, if we indeed make sure that everything is anonymous, we can rightfully claim that the use of this service would be out of scope of the GDPR and thereby GDPR compliant. Once again, I have the QR code for you while I take some questions from the audience, if there are any.